Good evening. My name is Ron Whitty. I'm on the faculty of the Graduate School of Design. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, David Joselit. Before I do that, I'd like to cover a few info points. Those of you who've been using Zoom lately may notice that this webinar has some different features. The chat function has been disabled so that we can better focus on David's presentation. David will respond to questions after he has finished his lecture. You, the audience, are welcome to send questions to him at any time during the lecture by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom center of your Zoom screen. The final talk in the GSD's virtual public lecture series will be on Monday, April 27th. Mexican architect Paul Cabrera will talk about how Doctors Without Borders is collaborating with the Spanish government to adapt existing infrastructure, medical and non-medical, to provide adequate care during the coronavirus epidemic. Cabrera's lecture will happen on Zoom like this and requires virtual attendees to register. More information about the Cabrera lecture, as well as how to register for it, is available on the GSD's website. Back to tonight's talk. Museums are extraordinary places. That's because they tell us things. As cultural institutions, that's also where they become volatile. What exactly do museums tell us? What should they tell us? Are there things they must tell us or ought not to tell us? Surveying the history of museums lets us glimpse some prospective answers to these questions. They hold our own histories. They hold our yearnings for others' histories. They hold fictions that are sometimes facts, and facts that are invariably fictions. The long arc of archival objectivity courses through their evolution, which is to say the museum radiates truth among its delicate display cases, encrusted rooms, and colonnaded entries. For some centuries now, museums have given us a way of understanding ourselves as the byproducts of all that came before us. We go to them thinking that when we leave, we'll somehow be better for it. Seeing all that sure-footed curatorial prowess always lets us set our compasses to a truer true north. And that's where David Joselit gets very, very interesting. David turns the museum upside down. In David's hands, true north is now true south, east, and west. David's most recent book, Heritage and Debt, Art and Globalization, recast the museum's role. What had been a stone-clad storehouse of knowledge is now a shimmering reservoir of percolating possibilities. Across David's pages, local usurps universal, indigenous topples colonial, and perhaps most vitally, prospect smothers certainty. Reading David, one wonders if the word museum is itself a relic without a cause. David is an art historian. He's remarkably prolific. His previous books include After Art in 2013, Feedback Television Against Democracy in 2007, American Art Since 1945 in 2003, and Infinite Regress, Marcel Duchamp, 1910 to 1941, in 1998. His essays are too numerous to list, but it should be noted that they are sustenance of the best sort. David also works with museums and galleries, something that I find especially exciting given his razor-sharp thinking about these very spaces. David received his PhD from Harvard and is, as of this year, a professor in the Department of Art, Film, and Visual Studies at Harvard. Those teaching and learning at Harvard can be very happy that he's here among us. He was, in fact, also an undergraduate here. David previously taught at the City University of New York, Yale University, and UC Irvine. The last place, he also happened to have been in the same department as my sister-in-law and her husband. This last point brings me to something a bit more personal. With all that David is and does, and with the extraordinary depth of his academic pursuits, David is simply a good person to have dinner with. I can chat with him across a bowl of noodles. Anyone can. Smart and can hold a spoon. What more could one ask for? Please join me in welcoming David to tonight's talk, Heritage and Debt, Art in Globalization.
Thank you, Ron. That was an amazing introduction. Especially, I'll always remember that I can hold a spoon. It's an important skill. It's a great pleasure to speak at the GSD, which has meant a lot to me, both during my undergraduate days when I wrote my undergraduate thesis with the architectural historian Neil Levine, and when in graduate school across the street. So I'm an amateur in architecture in the truest sense of the word, in that it is a love of mine, but I am definitely not an expert. So this is a proposition about a series of new museums that have emerged during the period of globalization. And with that, I will share my screen. Okay. The period of globalization has been a time of intense museum building. One of the questions I address in my recent book, Heritage and Debt, is how museums of contemporary art outside the West have developed a new architectural type, even as their architects are typically European, and how this type participates in transforming the museum from a mere storehouse of images into a generator of images as well, into a kind of publicity machine. As a type, the contemporary global museum responds to a dichotomy of museum models that were developed during the European imperial era, the museums that we're most familiar with, really. So-called universal museums that were founded in capitals of imperial activity, and national museums that were established in their former colonies. And here I'm just showing you the floor plan, out of date, of the British Museum, where you get a sense, I know the type is very small, but you get a sense of the effort to represent the world, to be encyclopedic on some level, whereas the National Museum in New Delhi is focused on a long period of time, but all within the Indian culture, broadly conceived. On the one hand, then, the so-called Encyclopedic Museum accumulated artifacts from around the world, often through forcible or otherwise questionable practices of acquisition in the name of a universal humanism. If the Encyclopedic Museum was dedicated to universalizing knowledge by assembling world cultures for the edification of European citizens, as a kind of Enlightenment project really, museums in former colonies also deployed the culture of non-European peoples for the benefit of the same Eurocentric gaze, but now, rather than as a kind of encyclopedic account of world culture, it is instead an ethnographic account of a particular subject culture. These institutions, such as the one in the National Museum in India, were originally founded by taking local culture, including local peoples, as objects of study, producing knowledge that assisted in the colonial project of domination. And I should say that the National Museum was renamed. The reason it is, I have on the slide that it was founded in 1949, because as you'll see when I recount the work of Saloni Mathur and Kavita Singh, that the museum was renamed and refounded in 1949 at independence as a national museum. As Mathur and Singh have argued regarding the history of museums in India, quote, the museum in the colony had been limited in its scope, being the museum of the colony. Its collections were confined to objects produced or found within the territory of the subcontinent. Here is that why I show you the map. This had made the museum incommensurate with the grand universal survey museums in the European metropolis, unquote. Even after decolonization, as Mathur and Singh argue, the colonial museum in India, as elsewhere, was reframed as a national museum whose purpose was to constitute and represent the new nation as an expression of a single world civilization, both to its citizens and to the world, rather than, as in the British Museum, for instance, an encyclopedic overview of all civilizations. An analysis of the National Gallery of Singapore allows us to consider how the global museum of modern and contemporary art may suggest a countermodel both to to universal museums in the West and to the nationalized post-colonial museums described by Mather and Singh. In other words, the problem here is how to make a claim of universalism, but within a regional context. I mean, it's a paradox, and one that I think has been played out institutionally and architecturally in these museums, and that's what I hope to argue for you tonight. Opened in 2015, its architectural design suggests an archaeological site rather than an encyclopedia. It's a kind of stratification rather than a monument. It embeds two adjacent colonial era structures, a neoclassical Supreme Court on the left with the dome and a city hall built by the British within new strata of museum infrastructure dedicated to modern and contemporary Southeast Asian art. So not solely Singaporean art, but art from the region. The facades of both the historical edifices have been kept intact, as you can see from this rendering, and with the exception of painstaking restorations in areas of special historical significance, like the City Hall chamber, where the Japanese surrendered to Allied forces in 1945, their interiors have been retrofitted to accommodate state-of-the-art galleries. So on the one hand, certain very important historical spaces have been restored within this building, but on the other, the museum looks like a beautiful, newly constructed museum that could be virtually anywhere in the world. In its design, the National Gallery thus appropriates two former seats of colonial power. And here I'm showing you a view from the entrance atrium. You can see the covering of the doorway in front of you, and on the left is the City Hall, and on the right is the Supreme Court. So you can see how the two buildings are embedded within a new architectural texture. As such, the former City Hall and court buildings, one administrative and one judicial, serve a double function. As primary components of the new museum's architectural ensemble, they house collections that narrate modern and contemporary Southeast Asian cultural history. So they are the container of a new history. But they themselves are important artifacts of the kind of beginning of that very history. And as such, the City Hall and court building are equally incorporated within the collection. So the building both houses and is housed by the museum, the buildings, I should say. Indeed, the gallery's inaugural exhibition of Southeast Asian art between Declarations and Dreams, Art of Southeast Asia since the 19th century, dates the history of modernism in Southeast Asia to colonial contact. So this is another one of these paradoxes that is implicit in this building project that is really kind of profound. Because what I'm going to read you a quote from one of the curators that makes this clear, but the point here is that modernity in Singapore is rooted to colonial times, and yet the colonial legacy is precisely what needs to be superseded. And therefore, the legacy must be both avowed and reframed. And so the building kind of does this in absolutely literal ways. But let me just read to give you a sense of how the history of Southeast Asian art and Singaporean art is founded in a kind of colonial initiation of modernism. This is from curator Phoebe Scott in the National Gallery. She writes, colonialism and modernity were not the same thing, but colonization did bring a different system of values into close contact with the existing structures and local cultures of Southeast Asia. To the extent that the modern is understood in terms of a conceptual break with the past, the environment of change and uncertainty created by this interaction can be seen as the beginning of a modern condition, unquote. So in other words, the colonial institutions absorbed by the gallery are thus not merely generic repurposed heritage sites. These are not sort of neutral buildings. They are artifacts of the colonial origins of Singaporean modernity that the National Gallery is tasked with simultaneously excavating and reframing through the agency of modern and contemporary art exhibitions. And this is important too, because it is the modern and contemporary art that is both collectible at this point, but also that can show an alternate story of modernity from these colonial institutions. The close association of this museological operation to the very political foundations of Singapore through its original constitution is indicated by the historical interiors and exhibitions that the gallery has chosen to preserve. In addition to the room commemorating the end of the Japanese occupation that I showed you earlier, there's a permanent exhibition, The Law of the Land, that I'm showing you a slide of here, opened in 2016, soon after the opening of the museum, in the former Chief Justice's chamber in the court building, which traces the nation's constitutional history from its founding by the British in 1819 to independence in 1965, with documents borrowed from the National Archive. So the point here then is that the political modernity of Singapore as colony is maintained within this museum consciously, whereas its contemporaneity is associated with art, as I will show you momentarily. At street level, the former City Hall and court building are connected only by an unobtrusive canopied glass atrium inserted between them. You see the atrium on the left slide and the canopy, which of course, I'm sure you're aware, it's extremely hot and sunny in Singapore. And so much has been done in this building to veil the sunlight. It is below grade in a lower level concourse, which I'm showing you on the right, which spans both structures, that the buildings receive a new foundation, both architecturally and conceptually, to accommodate requisite infrastructure of a museum, such as ticket desks, visitor services, auditoria, etc. This subterranean level rhymes architecturally with a layer of rooftop amenities. I'm showing you a slide of that on the right, which includes decks, gardens, and restaurants above the City Hall, and a smaller terrace surrounding the dome of the Supreme Court building, which you're seeing here. There also are restaurants up there. Now, importantly, these terraces give vantage points for looking back at the buildings themselves, which goes back to the point I was making earlier about how the buildings are themselves almost ready-mades within the collection of the museum, as well as containers of that museum. Jean-François Milou, whose Paris-based firm designed the gallery in association with the local firm CPG Consultants, describes his concept as follows. Sorry that this is quite small, but I'm more giving it to you for a sense of the stratification of the building as described by the architect, who writes the following. Our goal was to offer an elegant and welcoming art gallery that deeply respects the historical importance of the existing buildings and creates new architectural layers, each placed upon the monuments with minimal intervention. The key or signature of the design reflects our desire to add layers rather than to alter essential aspects of the monuments in the name of creating one institution. This architectural device of stratification, of layering, of putting the buildings into what I would call a kind of archaeological situation where they're almost excavated out of the contemporary museum, gives again, the sense that the buildings are not only containers, but part of the museum's collection. With its collections and exhibitions, the National Gallery articulates a second narrative, as I've suggested, alongside the becoming archaeological of Singapore's colonial legacy. Its presentation of modern and contemporary art of Southeast Asia makes its own alternative claim on universality by staging a story of national development that is shared by post-colonial states in the region. So in other words, what I want to suggest to you is that Singapore, in this exhibition, which I'll briefly summarize momentarily, is giving a universal story, or one should say a shared paradigmatic story of regional post-colonial states in place of the kind of encyclopedic impetus of the Western Universal Museum. Its presentation of modern and contemporary art of Southeast Asia makes its own alternative claim, as I mentioned, on universality by staging a story of national development that is shared by post-colonial states. As a tiny city-state within a complex, diverse region whose wealth and ambition outstrips its territorial expanse, Singapore has built upon its mid-20th century success as a manufacturing center to develop a sophisticated 21st century finance and knowledge-based economy. As the cultural critic C.J.W.L. Wee, who's the author of a great book that I recommend to all of you called The Asian Modern, has written, quote, of Singapore, culture combined with the stunning developments in information and technology can contribute to a post-industrial economy in which the management of creativity, ideas, and images mattered. Culture hence becomes a defining sign of the contemporary that the city-state must possess after the initial decades of pragmatic materialism. The state increasingly begins to deliver infrastructural monetary resources for arts development from the 1990s that was literally unimaginable in the 1970s, despite an ongoing regime of spectatorship. And I do want to, I need to mark this question of spectatorship, which is not trivial by any means. In fact, many of the museums I'm talking about here are built in illiberal city-states or things that operate like them. And we can talk about that. But for now, I want to try to develop this model without prejudging it. So Wee's characterization is consonant with a series of government-commissioned reports by the Singapore called the Renaissance City Reports, dating from 2000, that explicitly recommend investment in the arts as a means of continuing Singapore's shift to a post-industrial knowledge economy. In these documents, the utility of culture is explicitly linked to both enhancing an environment of creativity among Singaporeans themselves, as well as attracting high-skilled foreign workers by producing a vibrant and work and living environment. So it's extremely important here that the museum becomes a tool for creating an attractive post-industrial center. Despite its rapid rise as a regional financial center, as I've alluded, Singapore has no significant hinterland to draw upon for reserves of labor or as a physical buffer from its neighbors, while its success risks fostering resentment in the region. And in fact, I spoke with, when I visited the museum, the director of the museum, and he more or less mentioned this problem of a kind of issue of resentment among other arts organizations across the region that Singapore has to be very conscious of. The narrative established by the National Gallery's collection helps to address this geopolitical instability by embedding post-colonial Singapore within a broader Southeast Asian history, within which it lays claim to the privilege of exemplarity. So it's a complex move here. On the one hand, Singapore is one of many, but on the other, it's sort of the first among equals because of its capacity to develop cultural infrastructure. To this purpose, the inaugural exhibition, which I've already mentioned to you, Between Declarations and Dreams, Arts of Southeast Asia Since the 19th Century, was structured according to 4 sections. Now, I'm just going to show you, I don't have the time or the expertise, frankly. I mean, I did see the exhibition, but I could not say anything particularly interesting about it. What I want to show you is the different sections of it so that you see how the exhibition was meant to create a kind of genealogy of the struggle against colonialism and the post-colonial state. through artistic statements. So the first section is called Authority and Anxiety, 19th to 20th century, and was dedicated to addressing the colonial period through the display of visual artifacts ranging from European maps and landscapes to photographic portraits of local rulers, which you see on the right. The next section, Imagining Country and Self, 1900s to 1940s, tracked cross-currents, particularly in the genre of landscape, between colonial representations and indigenous associations during a period when art academies were just beginning to be established across Southeast Asia. The third broad section, Manifesting the Nation, from the 50s to the 70s, embraces the period of decolonization and nation building in the region by demonstrating in part a kind of aesthetic dialectic here between political forms of social realism, which I'm showing you examples of on the left, and forms of abstraction, which were meant to claim modernity in art worlds outside of the region. Finally, the last section, Redefining Art, 70s and After, surveyed global contemporary art during the period when Southeast Asian capitals such as Singapore became important global centers and when artists began to participate directly from those places in the markets and biennials of global contemporary art. By establishing an institution like the National Gallery to articulate this cultural narrative, supplemented by historical exhibitions of Singapore's colonial and constitutional history. Remember those rooms, the Constitution, the buildings themselves, these are two literally, they intersect architecturally and conceptually. By doing both of these things at once, this small nation lays claim to representing Southeast Asia symbolically, as in fact it might be said to do financially, as one of its major global business centers, and probably the one that is most friendly to Western commerce, as we will, as I will discuss in a different context in a minute. It is this regional claim to representation that substitutes for the universality asserted by Western encyclopedic museums. But in order to authorize this claim, to literally ground it, it must be placed within a quasi-archaeological excavation of colonial history that resituates the former City Hall and Supreme Court buildings within strata, or as the architect points out, layers of modern and contemporary art. So literally, the colonial history is excavated out of a post-colonial history that is made from an aesthetic narrative, but one that has strongly political valences. Indeed, the National Gallery Singapore exemplifies a model that is equally applicable to other museums in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. It's built around a collection of modern and contemporary art that claims to represent an entire region, and it is housed in a building rooted to its site through quasi-architectural excavation, whose design by a prominent Western architect is meant to garner international recognition, to produce publicity, going back to that idea that the museum generates images as well as housing them. A consideration of two comparable new museums indicates this model's adaptability. In Cape Town, the Zeitz Museum of Contemporary African Art, or MoCA, designed by the British firm Heatherwick Studio and completed in 2017, has also dramatically excavated exhibition space from the nested cylindrical towers inside a former concrete grain silo. And you see the building intact on the left and from the other perspective on the right. This is a rendering, but the building is complete, and I'll show you pictures of the actual building in a minute. Like the National Gallery Singapore, this building is an historical artifact. It's sited on the Victoria and Albert waterfront, a tourist complex whose website describes it as, quote, one of Africa's most visited destinations with 24 million visitors annually, situated in the oldest working harbor in the Southern Hemisphere. And It's also important to know that this is where tourists take off for visits to Robben Island, where Mandela had been imprisoned. So it is one of the kind of primary tourist destinations within Cape Town. Zeitz core collection, amassed by the German philanthropist and businessman, former head of Puma, Jochen Zeitz, aims to represent the 21st century art of the African continent. Similarly, the M Plus Museum in Hong Kong, which is yet to be completed, is built around a prominent early collection of Chinese contemporary art put together also by a European, the Swiss businessman and former ambassador to China, North Korea, and Mongolia, Uli Sig. And I'm showing you just a kind of poster for his collection, which is truly, really, I think, not controversially, the best collection of Chinese contemporary art in the world. It's a really stellar collection. And like Zeitz MoCA, the M Plus building, which is currently slated for completion in 2021, is designed by a celebrated international architectural firm, Herzog de Meuron. Finally, though newly built, M Plus will also be grounded in an excavation, sitting atop an underground railway terminal in the West Kowloon Central District in Hong Kong. The building will open onto the new railway infrastructure beneath it. Unfortunately, the slide is not terribly informative, and as the building is not yet open, I haven't been able to see the space in person. But the architect's account of it is extremely interesting. They write, "How should a post-industrial space be created from vacant land? A mere 20 years ago, the ground occupied by the West Kowloon Historical District, WKCD, was part of the seaport. Section by section, the land has been reclaimed from the sea and the natural harbor filled with earth. This artificial piece of land is now the construction site for the new building. What can lend authenticity to reclaimed land? Paradoxically, yet another work of engineering defines the specificity of the place, the underground tunnel of the Airport Express. Initially an obstacle that complicated planning, this distinctive feature has become the raison d'etre for our project, consisting of a rough, large-scale exhibition universe that quite literally anchors the entire building in the ground," unquote. So it might seem odd that M Plus is anchored by an underground transportation project. I mean, it's really perfect that it's to the airport shuttle that, in terms of its kind of both groundedness in a place, but linked to the whole world. But given at least after COVID, but given the enormous urbanization China has experienced since the 1980s, this mode of authentication seems richly appropriate. It is as though the symbolic value of the museum grows directly out of development in an allegory of how a new phase of knowledge-based economies have overtaken an earlier emphasis on manufacturing, as in Singapore. In Singapore, Cape Town, and Hong Kong alike, the impulse to root museums literally in their sites is also a consequence of how these institutions are oriented to global and expatriate audiences, often to the exclusion of local ones. Singapore's Renaissance City Plan of 2000, for instance, that I quoted earlier, advocates culture as a tool of economic development and as a necessary step toward attracting the kind of well-educated workforce it wants. If one of Singapore's priorities is attracting and retaining a global workforce, the program of M Plus is certainly directed toward protecting Hong Kong's special status, more and more precarious, as a mediator between mainland China and the world, particularly in a moment when its partial autonomy from the mainland is increasingly threatened. To this purpose, M Plus calls attention to its representative function by describing itself as one of the largest museums of modern and contemporary visual culture in the world that encompasses 20th and 21st century art, design, and architecture from Hong Kong, the mainland, and Asia beyond. So again, this idea of a regional form of universality, as it were. I mean, that of course is an oxymoron, but it's the one I'm working with and playing with you tonight. It is significant that the representation of Africa at Zeitz MoCA and of China at M Plus is based on European collections that were amassed privately. Moreover, Hong Kong and Cape Town, like Singapore, have prospered as enclaves where Western infrastructure allows them to function as within, but apart from the regions they represent, acting as commercial and cultural mediators between the West and Southeast Asia, China, and Africa. These cities not only proffer a kind of semi-official special economic zone or official special economic zone, but also special symbolic zones, where cultures are collected and curated in an effort to claim representative status on behalf of their regions. Perhaps this is why the museum historians Gail Dexter-Lord and Naguère Blankenberg can claim that museums, quote, are one of society's main adaptive strategies for managing change, unquote. The change that globalization proffers to be managed, of course, is double-edged. On the one hand, global cities emerge into prominence because they have the capacity to act as regional representatives. Domestically, these acts of representation equally serve to enrich localities that themselves have been drained of their own heritage, first through colonization and subsequently through neoliberal policies of economic development. So on the one hand, there's a way in which this placemaking works for the world of the city-states themselves or the cities themselves, but also is directed outward. It's a kind of double edge, literally. The global museum must be recognized as a means of managing a specific kind of change, therefore, the entry of global capital into new markets and a corresponding economic evolution from manufacturing or extractive economies to knowledge-based ones. And this is really, I think, one of the most important points here is that museums help move from manufacturing and extraction economies to knowledge economies. They are an index of that and also an agent of it. Indeed, in his account of the ambitious program of new museums pursued in Doha and Abu Dhabi since the turn of the 20th century, Alexander Kazerouni argues precisely this, that for the royal families of Qatar and the Emirates, building global museums assists in consolidating domestic political hegemony as well as establishing national stability. The efficiency of this type of soft power, he argues, was evident during the first Gulf War in the international outrage at the pillaging of the Kuwait National Museum. And you can see, sorry, I was not able to find images of the museum after it had been sacked during the war. But you can see reference to it and the bottom line from this web page text. So what Kazerouni argues is that the sacking of the museum generated sympathy in the West, which helped not only to generate support for the restoration of works carried off to Iraq, but also for ongoing military aid. In other words, the arts become a kind of attractor, not only of economic support, but military support from the West. He writes, the Kuwaiti experience in showing the potential of museums as a medium of communication directed to the West and the necessity of a clientelization of their cultural elites to guarantee military support thus prefigures the artistic programs of Qatar, Abu Dhabi, which emerged later. In describing the type of museum designed to generate such soft power, Kazerouni makes a distinction between what he calls root museums, which were typically founded in the 70s and 80s to give archaeological and ethnographical accounts of local histories, and mirror museums that have emerged since the 1990s and are outer rather than inner directed institutions aimed at establishing global networks. And so here, on the left, again, I visited in Dubai this amazing museum of the city of Dubai that was very much clearly meant for a local audience in that it didn't have any of the flash and glitter of the new museums of the Emirates. And in fact, what Kazaruni is arguing is that the sheiks used this kind of development of heritage museums as a way of unifying their power, and then museums like the Louvre Abu Dhabi are outer directed. In the new global museums that I've discussed, the National Gallery, Singapore, Zeitz and M+, the two types, the Mirror Museum and the Root Museum, converge. And this is really the point here that I'm making throughout this lecture, that there is a kind of archaeological embeddedness of, for instance, here, the Singapore Museum in its colonial history that is being excavated within the promenade of galleries. The most spectacular of the projects from the Emirates is the Louvre Abu Dhabi, which straightforwardly presents itself as a universal museum. It does make the claim that it is in fact a contemporary form of the Universal Museum, but it can do so because not only has it rented the name of the Louvre for 30 years, but it also is drawing from the collections of a consortium of 13 French museums over a period of 10 years during the development of its own collection. Now, despite this appropriation of foreign legitimacy, like the other new museums I've discussed, this one is symbolically rooted to its site, if one can say that, because it's a new island, Saadiyat Island, rooted to its site in a broader symbolic sense, through reference to an idealized typology of Arab architecture described by Jean Nouvel, its French star architect, as, quote, more of a neighborhood than a building, inspired by white Arab cities, the Medina. Now, it might be important, though perhaps a little mean-spirited, to mention that the Medina is a type indigenous to North Africa, but here there is a kind of Arabness that is being suggested as a rootedness. And I show you the plan. I know that you probably can't see the specifics of the plan, but it's only to give you a sense of how, in fact, the museum is not at all based on a Beaux-Arts plan, as universal museums tend to be in the West, but rather as this kind of very confusing, I can tell you from having visited, very confusing clusters of small pavilions. It is a very beautiful museum, I think, but also one with a lot of controversial dimensions. Not least of which is the fact that the construction workers who built this museum and who have been notoriously exploited are also foreigners. Here is where probably a nicer place where they live. But rather than coming from Europe like the institution's architects and curatorial advisors, they're largely migrants from South Asia. The division of labor that built the Louvre Abu Dhabi, as well as other museums and educational projects in the Emirates, thus reinscribes an imperial worldview within its global project. Europeans direct grand cultural institutions that are built on the backs of oppressed laborers from the global South. These asymmetrical labor relations correspond to Kazaruni's broader assertion that the new Gulf museums are structurally Western, though located in the global South. In arguing that the Gulf museums, and by extension those other new museums I've discussed in East Asia and South Africa, are made by Westerners and for Westerners, Kazaruni suggests that behind their claims to give voice to the formerly colonized of their region, the institutional and ideological structures of colonization remain in place. The cultural theorist Quanxing Chen's distinction between decolonization and deimperialization is useful in clarifying this condition. For Chen, decolonization, this is a quote, decolonization is the attempt of the previously colonized to reflectively work out a historical relation with the former colonizer, culturally, politically, and economically. So, in other words, it's a kind of recalibration of a relationship with the colonizer. Deimperialization, on the other hand, would entail a thoroughgoing transformation of the imperial values and cognitive structures that underlie the relationship between colonizer and colonized. So Chen insists that de-imperialization is just as necessary in New York and Paris as it is in Singapore or Cape Town, undoubtedly more so. It is indisputable that the new museums I've considered do attempt decolonization in Chen's terms by working out, quote, a new historical relation with the former colonizer, a relation of equality and competition even, primarily through programs that establish an independent global profile or brand while consolidating national identities for domestic publics. Both of these actions renegotiate relations with former colonial powers. They decolonize. But as we've seen, they leave the underlying asymmetry of the curatorial relation largely intact, consequently falling short of de-imperialization. As we have seen, the museum simulates and authorizes routes for the kind of extraterritorial, curated assemblages that global capitalism constructs by producing imagined communities or better imaged communities out of distributed networks. As I've argued, these three museums claim to represent an entire region in order to assert symbolic sovereignty over it on behalf of the cosmopolitan cities they occupy, cities that are special economic zones in spirit, if not in name, as well as special symbolic zones. But second, these same institutions consolidate the singular identity of their own locale by generating and disseminating images drawn from their spectacular architecture. Museums are typically understood as organizations that collect images, primarily but not exclusively artworks. They are less frequently acknowledged as generators of images. This capacity, however, explains a great deal of the contemporary interest in building museums around the world. As Beatriz Plaza, Pilar González Casimiro, Paz Morales Hueso, and Courtney Waldron conclude in their study of culture-led city brands, quote, an art museum can create branding capital through the narrative associations and images shaped on both the inside and the outside of place. The architecture itself is a non-reproducible piece of art. I would just parenthetically say that that's not entirely true, as we can see from this slide. Certainly the experience is non-reproducible, but not the spectacular image of the building. They continue, while brand channels like the media diffuse reproducible images at accelerating rates. The demand for these images increases as consumers absorb them due to increasing returns on utility. Image accumulation fuels increasing demand for place, which reinforces a brand and ultimately attracts cultural visitors. So what they're arguing is actually somewhat against common knowledge, which is that the reproduction of an experience actually produces more demand for the actual experience. And museums are, in fact, factories, one could say, for producing more and more images. They're places that use their capacity to transform images into places as a unique power to re-territorialize global networks, to bring globalization into a local place. Pictures attract us to places where when we arrive, we take more pictures that attract more people after they're posted on social media, etc. And this form of image proliferation and concentration moves well beyond tourism. The museum is not merely a representation of such global procedures, but an actor in establishing global assemblages by transforming their often invisible and far-flung commercial networks into attractive image-saturated places. Through the quasi-archaeological ensembles that I've identified in several new museums, these spectacular places are literally grounded. The museum becomes the privileged site within globalization of simultaneously deterritorializing and re-territorializing the image. It is the place, the museum is the privileged place where the immaterial networks of globalization are rendered material and not only rendered material, but used as symbolic capital. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take questions. Okay. The first question is, does the choice of a French lead architect reinscribe the settler colonial tradition that the National Gallery attempts to disrupt? Absolutely. I mean, this is the paradox, I think, of precisely of these museum projects. And it goes back to this question, I think, of visibility and wanting the museum to be a factory of images, of spectacle. Because what these places want is museums, they want the Bilbao effect. They want a museum that is going to bring people to a place and going to establish a profile for the place. And they believe that the fame of the architect, and I think that this, their belief is grounded in reality, will be effective in bringing those people in. So, I mean, this is one of the many paradoxes, including the fact that a place like Abu Dhabi, the Emirates, Singapore, are all illiberal places. I mean, these are places with heavy censorship. They're not democratic places. They're places where the museum is being used to project a certain kind of image globally. So I want to be clear that I'm fascinated by this dynamic of a kind of archaeological anchoring of a post-colonial narrative. But this is why I go to Chen at the end of the essay, where he makes this distinction between decolonizing, which means showing oneself as a modern state, a non-colony, versus de-imperializing, which would mean to really completely undermine what in the question Robert Levine is calling the settler colonial tradition. So thank you for that. The second one is, what conditions do you here, I can answer live. What conditions do you suggest one to consider to ensure they are creating a space that respects historical cultures? Well, this is a great question. And in my book, I mean, this is one of those cheesy answers, but I talk a little bit about what has been called Indian museology, or Native American or indigenous forms of museum practice, which have been, I think, on the forefront really of a kind of collaborative curatorial process where members of indigenous communities are invited in some institutions. The American Museum, the Museum of the American Indian in Washington, was a pioneer on this on a big scale, but there also are smaller regional museums who've done this, where certain kinds of indigenous properties, cultural properties that are sacred or are forms of knowledge that should be accessible only to those who are initiated or members of communities, are discussed with the curators in the institution. And the museum makes a big effort to bring together historical Native American artifacts with living presentations of Native American culture. So there is not this notion that the culture is gone, is historical or dead. So I think, in a way, I'm very critical of museums. I also really love museums. I don't think we could live without them, but I think that what needs to happen, and I know that my friends who are curators would tell me that this is often unrealistic, but I think it is a horizon that should be aimed for, and as I said, has been successful within Native American practices and museums, is to democratize the curatorial function in a much broader way. Now, I do think that in many ways, the Singapore Museum has done a good job, a better job than Zeitz, for instance, which is a kind of cynical contemporary collection produced by one collector with an art advisor who made a museum. So there are real distinctions here. Okay, Robert Levine has another question. Oh, I think I answered that question because I think that, yeah, I'm going to move on to another. Okay, this is from DS. Institutions that you are describing have in many ways mimicked European and US museums, same architects, redeveloping industrial structures, exhibited projects, claimed universality. However, regional institutions have political significance for the countries. What is their conceptual potential which could possibly influence Western institutions back? Oh, that's a great question. When I was at the Graduate Center, where I was before coming to Harvard, as Ron mentioned, just this very semester, an odd time to start. There was, I was part of a globalization seminar that was very focused, not exclusively, but quite engaged with questions of scholarship around the Black Atlantic, for instance, and how one, instead of thinking about histories of England or thinking about histories of the Caribbean or parts of Latin America, such as Brazil and North America, that the Atlantic, and particularly the Black Atlantic, where traffic in slaves and culture and products back to Europe all were occurring, is a frame of reference that's extremely important. And some of you, I'm sure many of you know the work of Paul Gilroy, for instance, many other scholars who have thought to really make, to think through the Atlantic as a crossroads, a cultural crossroads, in ways that aren't as kind of pastoral as that phrase suggests, through the slave trade, et cetera. So having lived a long time in Boston, for instance, one of the things that has really interested me, this could be done at the Metropolitan Museum in New York and other places as well, is, and this is being done much more, but to think, instead of the American galleries, let's say, and the African galleries, to think about a Black Atlantic gallery, where there is a kind of exchange of objects that mirrors a different history of their actual exchange. So I feel like, I actually think that these great encyclopedic museums can and are, in some ways, doing a lot to rethink the narratives that they support. What they can do, they have the collections to do this. These newer museums don't have those collections. So in a way, it's really up to them. Okay, so here's another question. Thank you for that one. From Martino, thank you for the lecture. Are the strategies of stratification, reframing, and adaptive reuse in these museums in decolonized cities different from comparable contemporary strategies in Western capitals such as the Musée d'Orsay or the Tate Modern? And if so, if yes, how? Well, that's a very good question. And I think the Musée d'Orsay, yeah. What is interesting to me about this question, and it would be great to have a longer discussion about this with, I wish that this was a more interactive context, but in a way, what the Musée d'Orsay was doing was bringing academic art out of the closet, right? So in a sense, it was kind of doing something, it was making a revisionist argument and using a kind of great, the train station as this kind of great icon of a certain sort of 19th century splendor. I'm not sure exactly what year that station was made, so it might be early 20th century. So I think in a way, what the Musée d'Orsay is an effort to do what I just mentioned as in terms of making a new narrative within the Western canon. Instead of there being, you know, I remember before the Musée d'Orsay, you would go to see, I'm old enough to have seen, you know, the great masterpieces of the Impressionists, just sort of completely outside of any kind of cultural context, which the new building as an excavation of a train station is in fact doing as well. So maybe I have to admit that the strategy is really no different, but the idea is that this kind of motif of excavation architecturally often enables and accompanies a kind of excavation of collections. I think I'll leave it at that and hope for future discussion. Okay, I think we can take just a few more questions from Annie Kim. I'm curious if even regional museums might be created from a position of power that chooses not to represent minorities, thinking particularly of the violence against Muslim minorities in India and China. Have the efforts of decolonization permeated beyond the architecture and into the organizational cultures of the institution? Again, a very good question. China and Korea are both places. I'm coming sort of sideways to your question. China and Korea are both places that have built huge numbers of museums in this period and have approached their museums in a different way. In China, a lot of them are private museums that are based on real estate development. But also, I think because the Chinese culture does not feel precarious in the way that the situation in Hong Kong, Singapore, the Emirates, and Cape Town is. It's not, these museums are focused more on either contemporary art or Chinese collections. The Long Museum, for instance, is an interesting case of this. It to some extent makes my point. It's a private collector museum in Shanghai that has 3 different locations. One of them collects cultural revolution era visual material. One of them is the contemporary collection. And I'm forgetting the third now. At any rate, you could argue that in a way they've separated the functions there, but the Cultural Revolution collection is in a way a kind of method of rooting archaeologically Chinese contemporary art in a legacy of Cultural Revolution. Has decolonization permeated beyond the architecture into the organizational structures? I think in Singapore and in M+, yes. I think in Zeitz, not so much. I think in Louvre Abu Dhabi, not so much. I think really it goes from institution to institution. Both the Singapore Gallery and M+ have really amazingly impressive world-class curatorial staffs. Okay, so I think I'm going to take just 2 more and go quickly. So Rob Aiken, do you have any thoughts about the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, simultaneously local and global, in an attempt to place a slave trade? You know, I wish I did because I haven't been able to go there, but I think that that is a great institution to bring into the mix, and I'm going to try my best to see that museum when we're able to travel again. Thank you for that question. And then one last question from Lawrence Franklin. Is there a difference in the role of an art gallery in a museum, and what is to be made of small local museums whose collections are so important to their communities, and specialized museums, such as the Bata Shoe Museum where I live in Toronto, with their often entertaining and unusual collections? Now, this is a really great question, and I want to make clear that in engaging with globalization, I'm trying to be very careful to, in fact, engage with globalization as a mechanism and as a set of conditions. And that means not everything that happens in the world, but a specific sense of a distributed form of economic activity and also aesthetic activity. So for me then, the scope of my project has more to do with these large museums that are really meant to not only to draw to make place for a foreign audience and also a domestic audience. With that said, what you're saying is incredibly important, and I think that small local museums have also been extremely creative in terms of tailoring their narratives to a place, and they're often the most innovative of museums. I think that, I guess what I would say is the difference between an art gallery and a museum is that a museum has a collection, and a collection is a kind of, not only a kind of material form of history of the institution and of collecting practices and the histories that those objects address, but also a kind of resource held in trust for that community. And so for me, museums are so much more important well, I should say they have a very specific importance, which is that they really are institutions that need to respond not only to their history, but the history that they're part of. And so I think that the most exciting thing right now is really to think about how to use collections. And one of the great things, the silver linings of the downturn of 2008, was that more and more museums turned to their collections because it was less expensive than loan exhibitions. And I think they've developed procedures that have continued since that time and probably will now continue as well, given the conditions we're living under now, to really rethink the museum by excavating collections. So with that, I will thank you and say good evening. I really appreciate your coming, and I appreciate all of your questions. So good night and thank you.